He hadn't sat at a proper table in 4 years. Not since the winter cholera swept through the valley and emptied out his life. So when the sleet hit and the widow pulled him inside her cabin, the smell of roasted meat and wet wool nearly broke him. He was a man made of frost and cracked leather, terrified of a wooden chair and a 5-year-old stare. This isn't a fairy tale about a hero. It's about a lonely man who came for supper, and the children who wouldn't let him leave. The elk quarter was heavy, 80 pounds of dead weight digging a trench into Cole's collarbone. His wool coat was soaked through, heavy as chainmail, smelling of old sheep and the copper tang of the animal's blood seeping through the canvas sack. Mud sucked at his boots with every step. It wasn't just raining. The sky was spitting ice, sharp little needles that stung his cheeks and gathered in the unkempt tangle of his beard. He kept his head down, the brim of his slouch hat a poor shield against the horizontal wind whipping down from the ridge. Through the grey curtain of the storm, the cabin appeared. It wasn't much to look at. Pine logs, chinked with mud that was steadily washing away, a sagging porch roof, and a stone chimney coughing thin, hesitant grey smoke into the violent sky. Cole stopped at the edge of the clearing. He didn't want to go in. He'd lived up on the timberline for so long that the idea of a ceiling felt like a threat. A roof was just something waiting to collapse on you. 4 walls were just a trap. But a deal was a deal. 2 weeks ago, he'd run into Cora down at the Mercantile. She'd been arguing with the clerk over the price of winter salt, her voice tight, a frayed edge of panic in it that she tried to hide behind anger. Cole had traded 3 pelts for a sack of salt and tossed it in the back of her wagon. He hadn't said a word. She'd looked at him, her eyes hard and tired, and told him she didn't take charity. "Bring me meat before the first freeze," she had said. "I'll owe you a supper. We'll be square." Cole shifted the elk on his shoulder, his left hand, missing the top joints of the ring and pinky fingers, gripping the canvas tight. He walked up the steps. The porch boards groaned under his boots. He kicked the mud off his heels, the sound violently loud over the howling wind, and knocked twice. Hard! He expected her to take a minute. He didn't expect the door to swing open almost immediately. Cora stood there. She held a heavy iron fireplace poker in her right hand, angled down, but ready. Her hair, a dull, unremarkable brown streaked with early grey, was pulled back in a severe knot. She wore a faded blue dress, the hem stained with ash, an apron tied tight around a waist that was entirely too thin for the coming winter. She looked at the elk. Then she looked at his face. "You picked a hell of a day to be a delivery boy, Cole," she said. Her voice was entirely devoid of romance. It was the voice of a woman who had spent the morning chopping her own kindling. "Meat's fresh," Cole grunted. His voice cracked. He used it so rarely it sounded like rocks grinding together. "Bring it in." She stepped back. Cole hesitated. The warm air spilling out of the open doorway hit him in the chest. It smelled aggressively alive. Wood smoke, yes. But beneath that, baking yeast, lye soap, dried apples, and the unmistakable, slightly sour smell of children. It overwhelmed him. Up on the mountain, everything smelled like pine resin, dirt, and nothingness. "I'll leave it on the porch," Cole said, stepping backward. The wind immediately threw a sheet of freezing rain down his neck. Cora didn't argue. She just looked at him. She looked at his soaking wet coat, the water dripping off his nose, the blue tinge to his lips. Then she looked past him, at the sky, which was rapidly turning the color of an old bruise. "The wind is blowing sideways, Cole. If you leave that meat on the porch, the wolves will have it by midnight, or the damp will rot it by Tuesday. And if you try to walk back up the ridge in this, they'll find you frozen solid in a snowbank come spring. I don't have the time or the shovel to bury you." She stepped to the side, pointing the iron poker toward the kitchen table. "Put it on the table. Take off your boots." Cole's jaw tightened. Flight instinct screamed at him. Run back to the timber, run back to the cold. But the sheer weight of the meat and the sudden, violent crack of thunder directly overhead anchored his feet. He stepped over the threshold. The moment the heavy plank door clicked shut behind him, the silence in his head vanished. The cabin was small, maybe 20 feet across. The fire popped and hissed in the hearth. Two small faces peered out from behind a hanging quilt that partitioned off a sleeping area. Cole stood frozen in the center of the room. He felt monstrous. He was too tall, too wide, too filthy. Mud was already pooling on her clean floorboards from his boots. He unceremoniously dumped the canvas sack onto the heavy oak table. The wood groaned. "Square," Cole muttered, turning back toward the door. "Take your boots off, Cole," Cora repeated. She wasn't asking. She had set the poker down and was walking toward the fire, grabbing a heavy iron kettle. "You're staying for supper. That was the deal. I don't break deals, and I don't let fools freeze to death on my property." Cole stopped, his hand on the iron latch. He looked at the door. He could leave. He should leave. But the smell of whatever was boiling in that kettle hit the back of his throat, and his stomach cramped so violently he had to brace a hand against the wall. He hadn't eaten anything but hardtack and dried jerky for 4 days. Slowly, awkwardly, he pulled his hand from the latch. He sat on a small wooden bench near the door, keeping his head down. He reached for his left boot. The leather was shrunk tight from the wet. It took a full minute of struggling, his breath hissing through his teeth to pry it off. Then the right. He left them neatly aligned by the wall. He stood up in his woolen socks. They had holes in the heels. He suddenly felt incredibly exposed. Cora walked past him, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating off her skirt. She smelled faintly of sweat and exhaustion. There was nothing soft about her. And yet, when she pulled a rough linen towel from a hook and tossed it to him, the gesture hit him like a physical blow. "Dry your hair," she said, not looking back. "Supper's in 10 minutes. There were 4 chairs. 3 were mismatched, scavenged things. The 4th, positioned at the head of the table, was a heavy, hand-carved oak chair with wide arm rests. A man's chair. A dead man's chair. Cole didn't sit there. When Cora motioned to the table, he took the rickety stool closest to the door, keeping his back to the solid log wall. A feral habit. Never put your back to an open room. The children emerged from behind the quilt. Will was maybe 8. He had his mother's thin build and a shock of wheat-colored hair that stuck up in odd directions. He wore suspenders over a patched linen shirt. Emmy was younger, 5 or 6, a tiny, feral-looking thing in a faded smock, clutching a wooden spoon like a weapon. They didn't speak, they just stared. Cole stared at the table grain. It was deeply scored, bearing the marks of knives and hot pans. He kept his hands in his lap, acutely aware of his missing fingers, hiding his left hand under his right. Cora set a heavy tin plate in front of him. Steam plumed upward. It was a stew of some kind. Mutton, mostly, swimming in a thick brown gravy with chunks of soft potatoes and withered carrots. Beside it, she placed a thick slice of dense, heavy bread. Cole's mouth flooded with saliva. The pain in his stomach flared into an aggressive ache. He didn't wait for a blessing or an invitation. He picked up the iron spoon and shoved a massive bite of the stew into his mouth. It was scalding hot. It burned the roof of his mouth, a sharp, blistering pain. But he swallowed it whole anyway. He took another bite, then another, shoveling it in with the frantic, mechanical rhythm of a starving animal. "Breathe, Cole!" Cora's voice cut through the haze. Cole froze, the spoon halfway to his mouth. He looked up. Cora was sitting across from him. She wasn't eating yet. She was watching him, There was no disgust in her eyes, just a flat, weary observation. To his right, Will and Emmy were staring at him with wide, unblinking eyes. Cole slowly lowered the spoon. A flush of heat, entirely unrelated to the stew, crawled up the back of his neck. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, realizing too late that his hand was smeared with dirt and old blood from the elk. He smeared it across his cheek. "Sorry," he rasped, staring back down at his plate. He forced his hand to release its death grip on the spoon. He picked it up again, lighter this time. He took a small, deliberate bite. Silence descended on the table, broken only by the scrape of spoons on tin and the relentless drumming of the sleet against the window panes. The wind outside shrieked, a high, lonely sound that made the logs creak. Inside, it was stiflingly warm. Emmy began kicking the table leg. Thump, thump, thump! Cole's eye twitched. The sound was rhythmic, vibrating through the floorboards up into his boots. It felt loud. Everything felt too loud. The clinking metal, the wet, chewing sounds, the shifting of fabric. In the woods, silence was survival. Here, noise was constant. "Emmy, stop," Cora said softly. The kicking stopped. Will pointed a finger across the table. "What happened to your hand?" "Will!" Cora's voice snapped like a dry twig. "Eat your potatoes." "I just want to know," Will shot back, his chin jutting out in a display of practiced defiance. He didn't look at his mother. He kept his eyes locked on Cole's left hand, which was resting awkwardly on the edge of the table. "Did you fight a bear? Jimmy Miller said a mountain man fought a grizzly and bit its ear off." Cole stopped chewing. He swallowed the bread. He looked at the boy. The kid was leaning forward, practically vibrating with the desperate need for a story, for a hero, for violence that meant something. Cole looked down at his ruined hand. The stumps of his ring and pinky fingers were shiny and scarred tight. "No," Cole said. His voice was flat. "No bear." "Indians?" Will pressed, leaning closer. Cole shook his head. He looked up, catching Cora's eye. She looked tense, ready to shut the conversation down, but she didn't speak. She let him handle it. "I was crossing the Powder River," Cole said, his voice quiet, devoid of any theatrical flair. "Mid-November. Ice broke. I went in up to my waist, climbed out, but my gloves were soaked. I couldn't get a fire lit fast enough. Hands went numb. When they thawed out, these two turned black." He lifted the hand slightly. "Had to cut 'em off so the rot wouldn't spread to the rest of the arm." Will blinked. The excitement drained from his face, replaced by a slight grimace of disgust. It wasn't a hero's story. It was a story about being cold, wet, and stupid. "Oh," Will said quietly. He went back to his potatoes. Cole felt a strange, hollow twist in his chest. He had disappointed the boy. It was a familiar feeling. He looked over at Cora. She was looking at him, and for the first time, the hard edge around her mouth had softened. Not into a smile. She didn't look like a woman who smiled much, but into something resembling truce. She reached for the pot in the center of the table and ladled another scoop of stew onto Cole's half-empty plate. "Eat," she said. Cole watched her hands as she pulled the ladle back. They were red, the knuckles swollen. The skin around her nails was cracked and peeling from lye water and cold air. They were the hands of a woman fighting a losing war against the wilderness. They were the most beautiful hands he had seen in half a decade. He didn't say thank you. He just picked up his spoon, and for the first time in years, he didn't taste ashes. The supper dishes were cleared. The heavy silence had returned, but it had changed. The frantic edge of starvation had worn off, leaving behind a thick, heavy lethargy. Cole stood up from the stool. His joints popped. The room felt smaller now that his stomach was full. He needed air. He needed the freezing wind. He needed the vast, empty dark of the timberline where he didn't have to worry about where to look or what to do with his hands. "I'll be going," he said to the wall. Cora was at the iron basin, scrubbing the tin plates. She didn't turn around. She just stopped scrubbing. Outside, the storm answered him. A gust of wind slammed into the side of the cabin with enough force to rattle the latch on the door. The sleet had turned to driving snow. He could see it piling up in thick, white drifts against the bottom panes of the single window. "You can't," Will said. Cole looked down. The boy was sitting on the rug near the hearth, whittling a piece of kindling with a dull pocket knife. Emmy was asleep on the floor next to him, her thumb in her mouth. "Storm's bad," Will added, not looking up from his knife. "Mule won't make it. You'll die." He said it with the blunt, matter-of-fact cruelty that only children who grow up in the territories possess. Death wasn't an abstract concept to him. It was a logistical fact. Cole shifted his weight. "I don't have a mule. I walk. I've walked in worse." It was a lie. He had survived worse, but just barely. Stepping out into a whiteout blizzard in the dark with soaking wet wool was a death sentence. But the panic rising in his chest, the suffocating weight of domesticity, the smell of the soap, the terrible, quiet intimacy of the woman standing at the basin, felt far more lethal. He walked over to his boots. They were still soaked, the leather stiff and unyielding. He sat on the bench and began forcing his left foot into the damp interior. It was agonizing. "Leave the boots, Cole." Cora turned around. She dried her cracked hands on her apron. Her face was pale in the lantern light, the shadows pulling at the corners of her eyes, making her look older than she was. "I brought the meat," Cole said, his voice rougher than he intended. He didn't look at her. He yanked hard on the boot leather. "We're square. I don't owe you anything else." "I didn't say you owed me," Cora replied softly. She walked toward him. She stopped a few feet away, close enough that he could see the steady rise and fall of her chest. "I said leave the boots. You'll freeze to death before you hit the tree line. I won't have your ghost haunting my conscience, and I won't have my children finding a frozen corpse when they go out to gather firewood in the morning." Cole froze, his hands gripping the edges of his boots. He looked up at her. He expected to see pity. He hated pity. But there was none. Only a rigid, practical stubbornness. "I don't stay in houses," Cole muttered. It sounded childish, pathetic even to his own ears. A grown man, a killer of men and beasts, terrified of a hearth fire. "Then sleep in the barn," Will interjected loudly. Cole flinched. The boy had stopped whittling and was staring at him. "Barn's got a roof," Will reasoned, pointing his knife toward the door. "But it smells like horse manure and wet hay. You'll probably like it better out there. Ain't no beds." Cora shot the boy a sharp look. "Will, hold your tongue." "He said he don't like houses," Will argued defensively. Then he looked directly into Cole's eyes. The boy's bravado cracked for a second, revealing a desperate, terrifying vulnerability. "But the barn roof leaks, and the door blows open in the wind. We got to tie it shut from the outside. If you sleep in here, you could hold the door if the wind gets too bad." Cole stared at the kid. It was a thinly veiled lie. The cabin door had a heavy iron drop latch. The wind wasn't blowing it open. The boy was scared. The man of the house was gone, and the wind was howling, and Will just wanted someone big and ugly to stand between him and the dark. Emmy stirred on the floor. She rubbed her eyes, sat up, and looked at Cole. "Stay," she whispered, her voice groggy. The word hit Cole in the center of his chest like a rifle ball. He couldn't breathe. His heart hammered a violent rhythm against his ribs. Stay. It was the most dangerous word in the English language. Staying meant attaching. Attaching meant losing. He had lost a brother, a wife, a life down in Missouri. The mountain didn't ask you to stay. The mountain didn't care if you lived or died. It was safe in its indifference. He stood up suddenly. The bench scraped loudly against the floor. He dropped the boot. "I can't," Cole said, his breathing shallow. He backed toward the door, leaving his boots on the floor. He reached for the latch. "I can't stay." He pulled the door open. The storm screamed into the room. A blast of sub-zero air and violent snow whipped across his face, instantly extinguishing the lantern on the table and plunging the room into chaotic shadows lit only by the hearth fire. The cold was shocking, a physical wall of ice. He took one step out onto the porch in his stocking feet. The snow was already ankle-deep. The freezing wet soaked through his wool socks in less than a second, biting into his flesh like teeth. He stood there, the wind tearing at his clothes, the black void of the night stretching out before him. Behind him, he heard a sound. It wasn't the wind, it was a sob. Quiet, immediately stifled, but unmistakable. Cole stopped. He closed his eyes. The sleet hammered against his face. He stood on the edge of the wilderness, the void calling to him, offering its cold, numb embrace. But the sound of that stifled cry, the sound of a terrified boy trying to act like a man, hooked into his spine and held fast. Cole gripped the doorframe. His knuckles turned white. He swore, a single foul word lost to the wind. Slowly, agonizingly, he stepped backward. Back into the light. Back into the heat. He grabbed the heavy iron handle and pulled the door shut, dropping the heavy iron latch into place with a definitive, ringing clack. The silence in the room returned, sudden and heavy. Cole stood by the door, shivering violently, his feet aching from the cold. He looked at Cora. She was standing perfectly still in the dim firelight, her arms crossed over her chest. She didn't smile. She didn't say, "I told you so." She walked over to the chest at the foot of the bed, pulled out a thick, faded wool blanket, and tossed it to him. "Floor's hard near the fire," Cora said quietly. "But it's warm." Cole caught the blanket against his chest. He looked at the rough fabric, then at the widow, and finally at the two children watching him from the hearth. He had stayed. God help him. He had stayed. He woke before the sun, his internal clock set by years of tracking game that moved in the pre-dawn dark. The floorboards were brutally hard against his spine. The fire had died down to a dull, pulsing bed of orange embers, casting long, bruised shadows across the cabin walls. Cole lay perfectly still under the wool blanket. He listened. There was the steady, shallow breathing of the widow behind the partition quilt, the occasional snuffling sigh from the girl, Emmy. The boy, Will, ground his teeth in his sleep, a harsh, grating sound that spoke of a jaw clenched tight against bad dreams. Cole carefully peeled the blanket back. The air in the room had cooled considerably, a sharp reminder of the icebox waiting just on the other side of the logs. He sat up, every joint in his body popping in a slow, aching symphony. His shoulders throbbed from carrying the elk. His left hand, the stumps, itched furiously, a phantom nerve pain that always flared up when the barometric pressure dropped. He needed to leave. The panic from last night hadn't vanished. It had merely gone dormant, buried under exhaustion. Now, in the quiet grey light seeping through the frosted window panes, it clawed its way back up his throat. He was an intruder here, a wild dog sleeping on a braided rug. He moved silently, rolling the blanket into a tight, military-style bundle and placing it on the bench. He found his boots where he had dropped them. They were stiff, the leather frozen into warped shapes by the sudden drop in temperature. He grimaced, forcing his feet into the icy, damp caverns. He didn't bother lacing them up all the way. He just needed to get out the door. He stood, his heavy wool coat over his arm, and reached for the iron latch. The coffee isn't boiling yet. Cole froze. His hand hovered an inch from the cold iron. He turned his head. Cora was standing at the edge of the partition. She wore a heavy shawl over her nightdress, her hair hanging in a loose, tangled braid down her back. In the grey morning light, stripped of her severe apron and tight bun, she looked younger, smaller, and vastly more exhausted. She wasn't looking at him with surprise. She was looking at his boots. "I have a long walk," Cole muttered. His voice was a gravelly whisper, barely functioning after a night of silence. "It's 20 degrees below zero out there, Cole," she said, walking past him toward the hearth. She moved with the stiff, mechanical efficiency of a woman who had to build a fire every morning of her life or watch her children freeze. She grabbed a poker and stirred the embers, tossing on a handful of dry kindling. The flames caught immediately, licking greedily at the dry wood. "I've walked in colder," he lied. "Maybe," she replied, setting a cast-iron pot on the swinging hook over the growing fire. "But you won't get far today. The storm blew the roof off the lean-to sometime around 3 in the morning. I heard it go." Cole dropped his hand from the door latch. He frowned, looking toward the small window. The glass was thick with frost, feathering out in intricate, crystalline patterns. He stepped over to it and scraped a small clearing with his thumbnail. He looked out. The world was blindingly white. The snow had stopped falling, leaving behind a sky the color of a bruised plum. But the wind had carved the snowfall into massive, rolling dunes. Cora was right. The lean-to attached to the side of the cabin, which housed her meager supply of split firewood, was gone. The corrugated tin roof had been peeled back like a sardine can and thrown 50 yards into the tree line. The woodpile itself was buried under a 3-foot drift of snow. "You don't have dry wood," Cole said, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. "I have what's in the box," she said, pointing to a small wooden crate near the hearth that held maybe 5 logs. "Enough for breakfast. After that, the fire dies." Cole stared out the scraped circle of glass. He could walk away. He had brought the meat. They were square. Digging out a woodpile and fixing a roof wasn't part of the transaction. The mountain didn't care if a widow froze. The mountain just swallowed whatever couldn't adapt. He turned away from the window. He looked at the iron latch on the door. Then he looked at the children, who were just beginning to stir behind the quilt, oblivious to the fact that their survival was currently measured in 5 logs of pine. Cole dropped his coat onto the bench. He reached down and violently yanked the leather laces of his boots, pulling them tight enough to bite into his ankles. "Where is the shovel?" he asked. Cora didn't smile. She didn't offer a tearful thank you. She just turned back to the coffee pot. "Back porch," she said. "Handle's splintered. Watch your hands." The cold hit him like a physical blow to the chest. It was the kind of dry, biting freeze that instantly froze the moisture in his nose and made his lungs ache with every drawn breath. Cole found the shovel. The wooden handle was indeed cracked down the middle, wrapped hastily in a bit of old leather twine. He waded into the thigh-deep snow, using his legs as much as the shovel to carve a trench from the back porch to the buried woodpile. The silence of the morning was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic thump of the shovel, biting into the snow and tossing it aside. He worked methodically, shutting off his mind, letting the mechanical repetition of the labor take over. This he understood. Physical exertion against an unyielding world. There were no messy emotions here, just snow, wood, and muscle. By the time he uncovered the pile, sweat was prickling under his wool shirt, instantly turning clammy against the freezing air. He dug out a heavy splitting maul resting against the chopping block. The iron head was rusted, the hickory handle smooth from years of use, by hands that were now buried in the churchyard down in the valley. Cole stood the first log on the block. He swung the maul. Crack. The pine split clean in two. The sharp, resinous smell of the sap blooming into the frigid air. It was a good smell. Clean. Honest. He settled into a rhythm. He swung, split, tossed the pieces aside, grabbed another log. He didn't notice the cabin door open. He didn't hear the footsteps over the crunch of the snow. "You're doing it wrong." Cole stopped mid-swing. He lowered the maul and turned. Will was standing a few feet away, wrapped in an oversized man's coat that dragged in the snow. A thick wool scarf wrapped entirely around his head, so only his eyes and red nose were visible. "Am I?" Cole rasped, wiping a bead of freezing sweat from his eyebrow. "Pa used to swing it over his head," Will said, stepping closer, his voice muffled by the scarf. "You're only bringing it up to your shoulder. You don't get enough power that way." Cole looked at the boy. He looked at the neatly split pile of wood. Then he looked at the heavy iron maul in his hands. "Your pa was probably taller than me," Cole said. It was a generous concession, and he probably didn't have a bad rotator cuff. You swing from the shoulder, you use your core, not your back. Saves your spine. Will narrowed his eyes, clearly suspicious of this logic. He walked over to the split pieces and began awkwardly stacking them into his arms. He dropped 3 for every 2 he picked up. "Leave it," Cole said. "You'll just soak your gloves. Ma says if you don't work, you don't eat," Will retorted stubbornly, bending down to retrieve a dropped piece of pine. "I ain't a freeloader." The word struck Cole oddly. Freeloader. He watched the boy struggle, his small arms shaking under the weight of the rough bark. The kid was desperate to prove he was useful, terrified that if he didn't pull his weight, he'd be discarded. Cole recognized that fear. He had lived with it for 30 years. Cole swung the maul again, splitting a particularly knotty piece of oak with a violent grunt. He leaned the maul against the block and walked over to the boy. "Drop 'em," Cole ordered. Will clutched the wood tighter, his eyes flashing defiantly. No, Cole didn't argue. He reached out with his right hand, his good hand, and simply plucked the top 2 logs from the boy's arms, lightening the load instantly. He didn't smile, and he didn't coddle him. "You carry the kindling, the small stuff," Cole said, pointing to a pile of splinters and thin branches he'd knocked loose. "I carry the heavy stuff. That's how a camp works. You don't burn out the greenhorn on day 1. Will looked at the massive logs in Cole's hand, then down at his own significantly lighter load. The tension slowly drained out of his narrow shoulders. "I ain't a greenhorn," he muttered. But he walked over and kicked at the pile of kindling, beginning to gather it up. They worked in silence for 20 minutes. A strange, fragile truce established itself over the chopping block. Cole split. Will gathered. The pile on the porch grew steadily. "Did you have a boy?" The question came out of nowhere, slicing through the rhythmic thud of the axe. Cole missed his mark. The maul struck the very edge of the log, glancing off violently and burying itself deep into the chopping block. The vibration shot up the hickory handle, stinging his palms. He left the maul stuck in the wood. He didn't turn around right away. The air suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The smell of the pine sap was cloying, suffocating. He closed his eyes. In the blackness behind his eyelids, he saw a small, pale face, slick with fever sweat. He heard the ragged, wet rattle of breathing that stopped abruptly in the middle of a miserable November night. "Cole?" Will's voice was hesitant now, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Cole opened his eyes. He slowly turned around. He looked at Will, standing in the snow in his dead father's coat. "I had a boy," Cole said. His voice was hollow, stripped of all resonance. It sounded like the wind blowing through a dead canyon. "Where is he?" Will asked. The innocence of the question was the cruelest part. "He's dead." Cole didn't soften it. He didn't offer a platitude about heaven or angels. He just handed the boy the brutal, jagged truth, because it was the only truth he knew. Will stared at him. The boy didn't flinch. He just nodded slowly, a profound, adult understanding passing over his young features. "My pa's dead too," Will said quietly. "Fever took him." "I know." Cole turned back to the chopping block. He gripped the handle of the maul and yanked it free with a vicious jerk. He didn't want to talk anymore. He didn't want to bond. He wanted to swing the heavy iron until his shoulders screamed and his mind went blank again. He brought the maul down hard. The log shattered. By late afternoon, the light had turned a bruised, pale purple, signaling another plummet in temperature. The wood was split and stacked high on the back porch, a solid wall of fuel between the cabin and the creeping frost. Cole had even managed to drag the twisted tin roof back from the tree line and roughly nail it over the worst of the exposure, using scavenged nails and the flat side of the splitting maul. His body was a map of dull, radiating pain. His hands were blistered, his wet boots had rubbed his heels raw, and the cold had settled so deep into his bones he wasn't sure he'd ever be warm again. But as he stood on the porch, looking at the neatly stacked wood, a strange, terrifying sensation twisted in his gut. It was satisfaction. A quiet, terrifying pride. He had fixed a thing. He had provided. For 4 years, his existence had been entirely destructive. Killing animals, gutting fish, cutting down saplings, leaving nothing but blood and ash behind. Today, he had built a barrier against the dark. He hated the feeling. It felt like bait on a steel trap. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The heat of the cabin washed over him, aggressive and thick. The smell of roasting elk meat and boiling potatoes filled the air, mingling with the sharp, acidic scent of chicory root. The hearth fire was roaring, feeding greedily on the dry pine he had just chopped. Will and Emmy were sitting on the braided rug, playing some quiet, incomprehensible game with a set of carved wooden blocks. Cora was sitting in the rocking chair by the fire. She had Cole's spare wool shirt on her lap. Cole stopped just inside the doorway. The door clicked shut behind him. He stared at her hands. She held a bone needle, expertly pushing it through a tear in the shoulder of his thick wool shirt. A tear he'd gotten 3 months ago, crawling through a bramble thicket to gut-shoot a deer. The sight of it paralyzed him. It was an intensely intimate act. Mending a man's clothes. It spoke of domesticity, of care, of a future. His wife, Sarah, used to sit by the fire with that exact posture, her head tilted, the firelight catching the wisps of hair that escaped her bonnet as she patched his trousers. The air in the cabin suddenly felt incredibly thin. Cole's chest tightened. A roaring noise, like a rushing river, started up in his ears. He wasn't in the cabin anymore. He was back in Missouri. The smell of roasting meat warped into the sickly sweet smell of cholera, of soiled linens and burning sage. "What are you doing?" The words tore out of his throat, harsh, loud, and jagged. The children jumped. Will scrambled backward, pulling Emmy behind him. Cora stopped rocking. She didn't drop the shirt, but her hands went still. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with sudden alarm. Cole didn't realize he was moving until he was standing over her. His breathing was rapid, shallow rasps. He reached down and snatched the shirt from her lap, his missing fingers catching awkwardly on the fabric. The bone needle ripped through the wool, leaving a loose loop of black thread. "Cole!" Cora started, pushing herself up from the chair. "I didn't ask you to touch my things," he snarled, backing away from her, clutching the shirt to his chest like a shield. His eyes were wild, feral. He looked like a cornered wolf, entirely disconnected from the man who had patiently shown a boy how to carry kindling an hour ago. "It was torn," Cora said, keeping her voice incredibly low, incredibly calm. She held her hands up, palms open, a universal gesture of pacification. "I was just fixing the tear. You chopped the wood. I thought—" "Don't think," Cole interrupted, his voice shaking. "Don't think you owe me. Don't think I owe you. We are square. We are done. He turned away from her violently, scanning the room. He needed his things. He needed his coat, his rifle, his canvas sack. He began grabbing them with jerky, uncoordinated movements. He shoved his arms into his heavy coat, ignoring the wet, stiff fabric. "It's dark, Cole," Cora said. Her voice had lost its softness. The hard, pragmatic edge was back. "The temperature is dropping. You walk out there now, you're dead." "I know how to survive," he spat back, grabbing his rifle from where it leaned by the door. "I survived before I met you. I'll survive after." He grabbed the heavy iron latch. He was suffocating. The walls were pressing in. The fire was too bright. The smell of the family was choking him. He had to get to the timberline. He had to freeze the memories back down into the ice where they belonged. He yanked the door open. The night air hit him, black and bitterly cold. He took a step out onto the porch. Something tugged at his pant leg. It wasn't a strong pull. It was incredibly weak, but it stopped him dead in his tracks. Cole looked down. Emmy was standing in the open doorway. The freezing wind whipped her thin nightgown around her tiny ankles. She wasn't wearing shoes. She looked up at him, her face pale, her eyes enormous in the dim light. She reached out with one small, slightly dirty hand, her fingers curling tightly into the thick wool of his trousers. She didn't say, "Stay." She didn't say anything at all. She just held on. Cole looked at her hand. It was so small. He could break her wrist with 2 fingers. He could pull his leg away, walk into the snow, and never look back. It was the easiest thing in the world to do. He looked past her, into the cabin. Will was standing by the hearth, watching him, his face an unreadable mask of childish fear and adult resignation. Cora was standing by the table. She wasn't begging him. She wasn't telling him to stay. She was just waiting to see what kind of man he actually was. Cole looked back down at the little girl. The wind howled, rattling the tin roof he had just nailed down. Slowly, his jaw trembling, Cole released his death grip on his rifle. The weapon slid down, the butt resting heavily on the porch floorboards. The fight drained out of him, leaving him hollow and incredibly, painfully tired. He didn't want to stay. He was terrified of staying, but he couldn't break the grip of that tiny hand. Cole stepped back into the doorway, pushing the heavy oak door against the wind, forcing it shut until the iron latch clicked into place. He leaned his forehead against the cold wood of the door, his eyes squeezed shut, his chest heaving as if he had just run 10 miles. "Supper's ready," Cora said quietly behind him. Cole didn't move. He just stood there, letting the girl hold on to his leg, trapping him in the very place he was most afraid to be. Supper was eaten in a suffocating silence. The elk meat was rich, the potatoes soft, but it all tasted like ash in Cole's mouth. He sat on the rickety stool, his back to the wall, watching the firelight play across the heavy oak chair at the head of the table. The dead man's chair. It mocked him. It was a monument to a life he was entirely unsuited for. He didn't sleep that night. He lay on the hard floorboards, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the wind die down as the storm finally blew itself out. But as the external howling ceased, a new, far more terrifying sound took its place. It started around 3 in the morning, a dry, hacking cough from behind the partition. Cole's eyes snapped open. He stopped breathing, straining to listen. The cough came again, wet and shallow this time, followed by a low, miserable moan. It was Will. The boy had spent an hour sweating and freezing in the snow, trying to prove he was a man. Now, the mountain was collecting its toll. Cole sat up, the wool blanket falling from his shoulders. The cold in the room was absolute, the fire having died down to grey ash. He heard the rustle of the mattress as Cora rolled out of bed. Bare feet slapped softly against the floorboards. A match flared, casting long, frantic shadows as she lit the lantern. "Will?" Cora whispered, her voice tight with a panic she was trying desperately to swallow. "Will, wake up! Drink this!" Cole didn't move. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, a violent, erratic rhythm that made his chest ache. No. The thought was irrational, a feral instinct screaming at him to flee. Not this. Not again. The air in the cabin shifted, suddenly heavy with the sour, coppery scent of fever sweat. It was the exact smell of the room in Missouri 4 years ago. The smell of his son, burning alive from the inside out, while Cole sat helpless in the corner, holding a useless tin cup of water. Cole stood up. His movements were jerky, uncoordinated. He grabbed his coat from the bench. He had to leave. He couldn't watch another child die. He couldn't sit in the suffocating heat and wait for the rattling breath to stop. He shoved his arm into the sleeve of the heavy canvas coat. He reached for his boots. "Cole." He stopped. He didn't turn around. "I need your help." Cora's voice wasn't a request. It was a lifeline thrown into a churning river. Cole slowly turned his head. She was standing at the edge of the quilt, holding the lantern. Her face was stark white, her eyes wide and bruised-looking in the harsh light. She didn't look angry, and she didn't look like a martyr. She looked like a mother, staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. "He's burning up," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper so as not to wake the little girl. "I don't have any willow bark left. The fever is moving too fast." Cole stared at her. His flight response was screaming, his muscles coiled tight enough to snap. "Walk out the door. The mountain doesn't care. It's just a boy." Boys die. He looked past her, catching a glimpse of Will's face on the pillow. The boy was flushed, his head thrashing slightly side to side, his breathing coming in rapid, shallow gasps. Cole dropped his coat onto the floor. He walked past Cora, not looking at her, and went straight to his canvas rucksack leaning by the door. He unbuckled the leather straps with his good hand, his movements sudden and violent. He dug past the spare ammunition, the sharpening stone, the tightly rolled spare socks, until his fingers brushed a small, leather pouch. He pulled it out and walked to the hearth. "Build the fire," Cole commanded, his voice a rough, mechanical rasp. "Get water boiling. Now." Cora didn't hesitate. She set the lantern down and immediately began shoving kindling into the ashes, blowing gently to resurrect the embers. Cole opened the pouch. Inside were strips of dried inner bark from a white willow tree he'd stripped down by the river basin a month ago. He grabbed a handful and dumped it into a small iron mortar. Cora kept on the shelf, grabbing the pestle and grinding the bark with a savage, desperate energy. The sound of the stone grinding against stone filled the cabin, drowning out the boy's ragged breathing. Cole crushed the bark into a fine, fibrous powder. He wasn't thinking about Missouri anymore. He wasn't thinking about the tiny grave he had dug with frozen hands. He was focused entirely on the texture of the bark, the smell of the dust, the immediate tactical problem of the fever. When the water in the kettle began to hiss and bubble, Cole dumped the powder into a tin cup and poured the boiling water over it. The liquid instantly turned a murky, dark brown, smelling earthy and bitter. "Let it steep for 2 minutes," Cole said, stepping back from the fire. His hands were shaking. He hid them in his pockets. Cora stood beside him. She looked at the cup, then up at Cole. "Thank you," she breathed. "Don't thank me yet," he muttered, turning his back to the fire and staring at the frost-covered window. If it doesn't break the fever by sunrise, the bark won't matter. The next 4 hours were a brutal, agonizing crawl. They took turns. Cora sat by the bed, forcing the bitter tea down Will's throat drop by drop, wiping his burning forehead with a rag dipped in snow water. Cole sat on the floor by the hearth, feeding logs into the fire, keeping the cabin brutally hot to force the sweat. They didn't speak. There was no room for words. The silence was thick, heavy with the terrifying possibility of death. Cole watched Cora's silhouette against the wall. She was tireless. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. She just worked, a machine made of maternal desperation and sheer grit. Cole found himself watching the line of her shoulders, the way she brushed a stray lock of hair out of her eyes with the back of her wrist. He had spent years convinced that survival was a solitary endeavor, that to care for someone else was simply a vulnerability, a weak flank waiting to be exposed. But watching her fight for the boy in the dim, suffocating heat of the cabin, he realized a terrifying truth. Her strength wasn't solitary. Her strength was tethered. She was surviving because she had to, not in spite of it. Just before dawn, the sound changed. The ragged, shallow gasps from the bed slowed. They deepened. The wet, hacking cough subsided into a long, shuddering sigh. Cole stood up from the hearth. His knees popped in the quiet room. He walked slowly over to the partition. Cora was slumped in a chair beside the bed, her head resting on the edge of the mattress. Will was asleep. His breathing was steady, the flushed, angry red having faded from his cheeks. His hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat, but he wasn't thrashing anymore. The fever had broken. Cora lifted her head. She looked at Cole. The exhaustion in her eyes was profound, stripping away every layer of pride and defensiveness she possessed. "He broke," she whispered. Her voice cracked. Cole nodded slowly. The tight iron band that had been wrapped around his chest since 3 in the morning finally, agonizingly, snapped. He let out a long, slow breath, leaning his shoulder against the rough timber of the wall. Cora stood up. She swayed slightly, catching herself on the edge of the table. She walked past Cole, out into the main room, and collapsed into the rocking chair by the dying fire. She buried her face in her hands. She didn't sob, but her shoulders shook with the silent, delayed shock of what they had just averted. Cole watched her from the shadows. He should give her privacy. He should go back to his corner, roll up in his blanket, and rebuild the walls. Instead, he walked over and knelt by the hearth. He tossed 2 more pieces of pine onto the fire, watching the sparks spiral up the stone chimney. He stayed on one knee, close enough that he could smell the stale sweat and wood smoke clinging to her dress. Slowly, Cora lowered her hands. She stared at the flames. "I thought I was going to lose him," she said to the fire. "I thought the mountain finally figured out a way to take him." "The mountain doesn't think," Cole said softly. His voice was less gravelly now, smoothed out by the exhaustion. "It just is. It doesn't want you dead, but it doesn't want you alive, either." Cora turned her head and looked at him. "And what do you want, Cole?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Cole looked down at his hands resting on his knee. He looked at the mangled left hand, the shiny, ugly scars of the amputated fingers. It was a hand built for violence, for holding a rifle, for skinning a carcass, not for holding a teacup, not for holding a woman. "I don't know how to want things anymore," Cole confessed. The admission tasted like blood in his mouth. It was the truest thing he had said in years. "I know how to not freeze. I know how to not starve. Everything else just feels like a trap." Cora didn't offer a gentle platitude. She reached out. Her fingers were rough, the knuckles swollen. She didn't touch his shoulder or his arm. She reached out and placed her hand directly over his ruined left hand. Cole flinched instinctively, every muscle tightening, ready to pull away. He hated people looking at it, let alone touching it, but her grip was firm. She didn't trace the scars with morbid curiosity, and she didn't stroke it with pity. She just held it, skin to skin. A pragmatic, grounding pressure. "You're alive, Cole," she said softly, her thumb pressing into the back of his hand. "Whether you want to be or not, you're breathing. You bled for this wood. You ground the bark for my son." She leaned slightly closer, the firelight casting a warm, amber glow across the exhaustion on her face. "You aren't a ghost. Stop acting like one." Cole looked at her hand, covering his. The warmth of her skin seeped into the dull, aching cold of his joints. He didn't pull away. For the first time in 4 years, the silence in the cabin didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an anchor. He slowly turned his hand over, his remaining fingers gripping hers in return. It wasn't a romantic grasp. It was the desperate, crushing grip of a drowning man who has just found a piece of driftwood. They sat like that until the sun finally broke over the ridge, painting the frost on the window panes gold. 2 days later, the world began to melt. The storm had passed, leaving behind a blindingly bright, painfully clear blue sky. The temperature crept just high enough for the massive snowdrifts to begin weeping, the sound of dripping water echoing constantly off the eaves of the cabin. The timberline, visible through the window, looked entirely different in the sunlight. It looked less like a wall and more like a road. Will was sitting up in bed, weak but ravenous, eating a bowl of rabbit broth Cora had made from a snare Cole had set the day before. Emmy was back to kicking the table leg. Cole stood by the door. His canvas rucksack was packed, the straps pulled tight. His rifle was slung over his shoulder. His boots were laced tight. It was time to go. The deal was done. The meat was delivered. The wood was chopped. The fever was broken. He had overstayed his welcome, and the sudden, terrifying intimacy he had shared with Cora by the fire terrified him in the light of day. Cora stood by the iron basin, washing the morning plates. She didn't ask him to stay. She had made her peace with who he was. "Sun's high," Cole grunted, shifting the weight of the rifle on his shoulder. "Snow's crusting over. It'll hold my weight. I can make the ridge by nightfall." Cora dried her hands on her apron. She turned and looked at him. There was no desperation in her eyes today, just a quiet, profound sadness that she tried to hide behind a stoic nod. "Safe travels, Cole," she said. She walked over to the table and picked up a small, tightly wrapped package of waxed paper. She held it out to him. "Dried apples and some salted venison. For the trail." Cole looked at the package. He didn't want to take it. Taking it meant accepting care. But he reached out and took it anyway, shoving it into his coat pocket. "Much obliged," he muttered. He looked toward the bed. Will was watching him over the rim of his bowl. "You coming back?" the boy asked, his voice still slightly hoarse. Cole hesitated. Lying to the kid felt like a sin, but the truth felt like a knife. "Mountain's big, Will. Hard to say where a man ends up." He turned back to the door, grabbed the iron latch, and pulled it open. The sunlight hit him like a physical force, blinding and hot against his face. The air smelled of wet pine and melting snow. It smelled like freedom. It smelled like nothingness. He stepped out onto the porch, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, with a finality that made his stomach drop. He walked down the steps, his boots crunching loudly in the crusty snow. He didn't look back. He walked past the woodpile he had chopped, past the repaired lean-to, and aimed himself straight for the dark line of the timber on the ridge. He made it 50 yards, then 100. The cabin was entirely silent behind him now. The only sound was his own breathing and the steady, rhythmic crunch of his boots. This was what he wanted. The isolation, the cold, logical mechanics of survival. He reached the edge of the tree line. He stopped to adjust the strap of his rucksack. He turned around. The cabin looked incredibly small against the vast, towering expanse of the snow-covered valley. A thin, defiant ribbon of grey smoke curled up from the stone chimney, fighting against the vast, empty blue sky. Cole stared at the smoke. He thought about his lean-to up on the ridge. It would be freezing. It would be dark. He would sit on the dirt floor, eat dried jerky, and stare at the wall until spring. He would survive, absolutely. He was excellent at surviving. But as he stared at the cabin, the memory of Cora's rough hand, covering his scarred fingers, slammed into his chest. He remembered the smell of the willow bark. He remembered the infuriating, rhythmic thump-thump of Emmy kicking the table leg. He realized, with a sudden, violent clarity, that he didn't want to just survive anymore. He was exhausted. He was so incredibly, deeply tired of being cold. Cole stood on the edge of the wilderness for a long, quiet minute. The wind blew through the pines, whispering its indifferent promises of isolation. "Go to hell," Cole whispered to the mountain. He turned around. He didn't run. He walked, but his stride was longer, deliberate. He crossed the 100 yards of snow, the crunch of his boots sounding less like a retreat and more like an approach. He walked up the porch steps. He didn't knock. He put his hand on the iron latch and pushed the door open. The heat of the cabin hit him instantly, the smell of wood smoke and baking bread wrapped around him. Cora was at the table, kneading dough. Will was still in bed. They both froze, staring at him as he stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the blinding white snow. Cole didn't say a word. He stepped inside. He closed the heavy oak door behind him, dropping the iron latch into place with a loud, ringing clack. He walked over to the bench. He unslung his rifle and leaned it deliberately in the corner. He shrugged off his heavy canvas rucksack and dropped it onto the floorboards with a heavy thud. Cora's hand stopped moving in the dough. Her breath hitched. Cole sat down on the bench. He reached down, grasped the heel of his left boot, and yanked it off. Then the right. He lined them up neatly against the wall. He stood up in his stocking feet. He looked at Cora. Her eyes were shining, a mixture of disbelief and a desperate, fragile hope. Cole walked past her. He didn't go to the rickety stool by the door. He walked to the head of the table. He pulled out the heavy, hand-carved oak chair. The wood groaned softly against the floorboards. Cole sat down. He placed his hands, both of them, flat on the scarred grain of the table. He looked at the widow. Then he looked at the boy in the bed. "I'm hungry," the mountain man said. And for the first time in 4 years, Cole was finally warm. That's where we leave Cole and Cora, proving that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do isn't face